Hi, this is Brock Dickinson coming to you today from the city of Toronto in Canada as we overlook Toronto Harbour. I wanted to talk today about an issue that often is a source of consternation for economic developers, no matter where in the world we operate from. And that's this question of whether it's better to pursue economic development activities at the very local level or to think about regional collaborations and regional approaches to economic development. And there's a lot of weight and discussion and research and thinking on both sides of this question. But let me start with one of the things that the academics have sort of weighed in here. And this is a series of ideas that were popularized through the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy a number of years ago. And they really suggest that there are two types of regional approaches to economic development, two ways in which we kind of think about regional collaboration as a tool for economic development purposes. The first of these, the academics refer to as the ad hoc approach or ad hoc regionalism. And this is stuff that just kind of happens on the fly, spur of the moment. And there's a few reasons that we might start to do this kind of regional work. One is that there is some sort of a threat that has arrived. So there's a message comes to the community that, hey, the pulp and paper mill in your community might be closing down. There's some struggles in the market, there's some struggles in the ownership, and there's a risk that this is going to close. And sometimes we feel that rather than just the municipality within which that plant is located has to deal with this, we can kind of understand that, hey, let's round up the neighbors. Let's get everybody within the region to sort of think about how we could cooperate with a strategy to kind of mitigate that threat. The second reason we might do regional collaboration is that the threat has turned into a crisis. So in this instance, let's imagine that the workers showed up at the automotive factory this morning and the gates were locked shut and the company had run off to Mexico or something like that. And so this crisis has hit the community. And there's this sudden job loss, sudden consternation. There's all sorts of displacement. There's panic to some degree in the community. And once again, it may make sense to get everybody together, to get all of the various affected partners and regions and communities and agencies and organizations around the table to say, hey, how can we do this? The third reason for ad hoc regionalism is much more positive, and that is we've been presented with some kind of an opportunity. An investor has arrived from Germany, wants to bring some sort of manufacturing facility to our region, and we need to kind of explain the value of this location to them. And sometimes the regional, the collaborative, cooperative approach works better in that situation than the localized approach, the individual approach does. The academics suggest, though, that, hey, if there are reasons for ad hoc regional collaboration, does that not suggest some kind of natural advantage to collaborative approaches and structures? And therefore, maybe regionalism isn't something that should just happen on an ad hoc basis. Maybe it should be done on purpose. And this is, of course, referred to as on-purpose regionalism. This is the notion that there's a rationality to regional collaboration. And if it makes sense, if it's rational, then we should just do it all the time. And we should sort of set up economic development structures in a way that they are regionally oriented in what they do. Now, this is a big debate, and it sort of crosses into a lot of political issues because typically our economic development structures are defined by political entities. They work on behalf of municipalities or counties or states or provinces. And there's this sense that, how am I supposed to think regionally if I belong to the political structure of a specific place or a specific jurisdiction? And so there is a kind of a tension that exists in the economic development world around this regional versus local issue. And I think sometimes this can play out in really interesting ways. That as we think about the way in which we create the boundaries of political entities, it's a bit of an arbitrary process. How do we set the boundaries of a municipality? How do we define the borders of a state or a nation? Well, we know that practically what we do is we get out a piece of paper, we draw a map, and we put lines on that map that tell us where these specific territories end. And intellectually, that's something we can kind of wrap our heads around. But practically, that isn't always the most effective way to kind of think about the areas in which we are attempting to do economic development, because those artificial boundaries can sometimes create obstacles to truly effective economic development activities. I sort of think about the challenges that many countries in Africa face as a legacy of colonization. So we think about the scramble for Africa in the 1800s, where European powers essentially carved up the entire continent, took over virtually every part of the continent as sort of colonial outposts of their empires. And one of the things that they did in that process was to bring many of their own traditions and practices from their home countries and impose them into the African environment. And so we think about even simple things like, what side of the road do you drive your car on? And the British, of course, drive on a different side of the road than the French do. And as they moved into Africa, they brought those driving traditions with them. And so we get these challenges around questions like, what happens when a road passes from a former British colony into a former French colony? And the reality is chaos. We have to kind of figure out systems to reroute the traffic in a way that doesn't cause massive numbers of head-on collisions. And so in some of the poorest places on the planet, we see these attempts to build massive cloverleaf bridge tunnel traffic systems to reroute traffic in a way that provides safety for vehicles crossing that border. And it seems kind of silly that somehow that imaginary line that defines the border defies the reality of what's on the ground and forces us into these sort of convoluted solutions to try to solve this. I worked a number of years ago in a part of rural Nova Scotia where this issue became a very specific problem. The town, the village of Bear River is actually divided between Digby County and Annapolis County in Nova Scotia. The Bear River runs right down the center of the town, and the river has been used as the dividing line between the two counties. So interestingly, the Annapolis County Council decided a number of years back that they wanted to build a sewage treatment plant for that particular community. And in fact, they wanted to do something really innovative and creative. They built what was known as a passive solar aquatic treatment facility, basically a kind of an indoor swamp that was using natural processes to treat wastewater so that it could be released back into the environment. This was a very innovative project, and people actually came from all over the world to view and to observe this plant functioning. The challenge in this case was that the plant, having been built by Annapolis County, did not have authorization to hook up the Digby County side of the community to the facility. And passive solar aquatic facilities require a certain amount of inflow to be able to actually function. If they don't reach that minimum level of inflow, they don't work. And this became the challenge in the context of Bear River, that without Digby County signed up to the sewage treatment plant, it just didn't function. So here were people traveling from all over the world to see this innovative technology, and that imaginary political line that ran down the center of the river prevented the technology from working. Now, eventually Digby County did join in on the initiative and sign up, and they worked things out with Annapolis County, and the plant functioned for many years. But it's an example of how the imaginary lines that we draw can create obstacles to economic development. And I think in that context, it's worth thinking a little bit about how we tend to draw and create those imaginary lines. Like, where does that tradition come from? And the answer is, of course, that it's out of the European map-making tradition. If we think about places like England and France, this is where our earliest Western-style maps emerge from. And the purpose of those early maps was to define royal prerogatives. So, for example, the king or the queen or the king's friends, the dukes and the barons and the earls and all these folks, they were often given hunting rights that other people didn't have. There were certain areas that were restricted for their use only. And how did you tell people where these areas were? Well, you imagined what the land might look like from a bird's eye view, and then you drew a little line around those spaces where only the king or the queen or their friends were allowed to hunt and everybody else was excluded. The interesting thing about that process is it's effective for drawing pictures, but on the ground, it often is problematic. The animals that live in those spaces don't know when they've crossed that imaginary line. A river or a stream that flows in and out of that enclave, that clearly defined mapped space, doesn't know that it's crossed some sort of an imaginary line. And so while European style maps are very functional from some perspectives, they're limited in some other ways. And in fact, there are other map-making traditions that shed light on different ways of thinking about how we can draw the boundaries around our community. So amongst the Mi'kmaq communities, this is the First Nations, indigenous communities of the Atlantic provinces of Canada and portions of Quebec, they have a very different map-making tradition. On a Mi'kmaq map, two communities that are connected by water are shown as very close together. They're depicted as being close together because the travel time it takes to get from one to the other is very low. I can jump in a canoe, I can sort of get into the water, I can make my way to that community quite quickly. But if those communities were in fact separated by a swamp or a big forest or a mountain range, something that was difficult to traverse, I would depict those communities as being further apart. And so Mi'kmaq maps really focused on the notion of links between communities rather than lines of exclusivity around communities. And I think sort of thinking about our economic development regions from that perspective opens up some really interesting possibilities. If we think about an investor that's often looking to come to our community, they're not interested in what sits inside the municipal boundaries in most instances. They'll be interested in things like, what's the shape of the regional economy? What's the context of regional infrastructure in terms of roads and ports and harbors and airports and these sorts of things? They'll also be interested in the availability of a workforce that meets their needs. And they don't really care whether that workforce sits inside municipality A or whether it comes from a broader region. And in fact, we're often able to make a more compelling case by talking about those regional assets rather than the local assets. So in some sense, we've got this tension that sits in economic development, where we recognize that the best case we can make is often regional, even though our organizations have often been created from that local perspective. The mayor, the county chair, the warden, the governor, the premier, they all want to know what happened within their political jurisdiction, but sometimes building successful economies requires us to think about partnerships and collaborations that move well beyond those political boundaries, because that's where the economy is, and that's what investors and businesses are most interested in.